Chainsaws. Big problem, right? You can only hold 2 chainsaws at a time, a configuration known as dual wield. Now, an enterprising person could probably manage to put a few more chainsaws on their body, maybe in a one-man band kind of configuration with foot saws and knee-activated saws and a harmonica saw and a head saw. I think maybe this one would have to be duct taped on. And while we're at it, we probably should add some night vision goggles.
Tactical.
But the records for most chainsaws simultaneously brandished were all set by a different technique, which is juggling. Now, you might think that you can equip an arbitrary number of chainsaws by juggling them higher and higher into the air, a configuration known as infinity wield. But unfortunately, once you juggle them high enough, you have to throw them fast enough that they exceed the escape velocity of 11,000 kilometers per second. And then instead of coming back to you, they just go off into space. But we're not limited to throwing these things straight up. We could also throw them tangent to the Earth, shy of the escape velocity, and this will create an orbit where they'll go around the Earth and come back and land in our other hand, which is very convenient for juggling. Here's a computer simulation of that. We can, of course, ignore air resistance, since chainsaws will cut through the air like butter. We get a nice elliptical orbit. And of course, we could pack many chainsaws into this orbit at the same time. Let's see if we can catch it. Oh, well, pretty close. So now we've got these saws shooting by at 11,000 kilometers a second, and we catch and launch them back into orbit. The saws can be efficiently packed in this nice arrangement. And so really what's going to limit us is the volume of chainsaws that we can fit into this reachable area for juggling. So in this volume, we'll see about 55,390 saws per second. And since one orbit takes 335.6 hours, we'll have that long before we see a saw a second time. Thus, we're simultaneously brandishing 1.215 times 10 to the 12 saws. This is a configuration known as tera wield. Now, I don't have any chainsaws. I live in the city where I have 2 trees, and if I cut those down, I'm done. So there'll be none of that. But we could consider juggling with something that's even more dangerous: data. Radio waves below 40 megahertz actually bounce off the upper atmosphere, the ionosphere. And they can do this multiple times. In principle, we could make it all the way around the world. We only need to talk about principles here because we're obviously not going to do this. But if you did, the circumference of the Earth is about 40,000 kilometers, which means that it'll take at least 150 milliseconds at the speed of light for radio waves to make their way around the Earth this way. And we can keep transmitting as the data makes its way around the world, which means that by the time we receive our first byte back, we'll have sent something like 750 kilobytes. Then we can receive that byte and send it again. If we have 750 kilobytes in flight all of the time, it's like we're storing that data in the radio waves, like we're using the world as a hard drive. Instead of using radio waves, let's just use internet waves. It turns out that there are computers all around the internet that will send a message back to you if you send them a message. This message is called ICMP echo, to which they'll send an ICMP echo reply. And that message basically consists of a packet that says what your source IP address is and where you're sending it, the destination IP. And then there's a payload, some freeform data, which gets returned as is. So I send one of these packets to Australia with my return address on it and some data that I want to quote unquote store. Then I can discard that data, and when it comes back, I can read it. And I could do this to a bunch of hosts around the internet, and in doing so, store a significant, amount of data in the internet. So let's do that. And not just that. This is the true story of hard drives we didn't want or need. It's called Harder Drive.
Harder drive. Harder drive.
By the way, this ICMP echo thing is also known as a ping. So I put together some code to send out a lot of pings, and while I was doing that, I figured, why not ping the whole internet? And so I did. By internet here, I mean the IPv4 address space, which are addresses that you know and love, like A.B.C.D, each of which can go from 0 to 255. Those are 8 bits. So together we have 32 bits, or 4.2 billion addresses. Now, I don't care about IPv6. There's way too many addresses, and most of them aren't used. Plus, Call me when you're at least version 7, am I right? IPv4 is great, and 4.2 billion isn't that big of a number anymore. With my home internet, which is advertised as 1 gigabit per second, I should be able to finish in about 20 minutes. Or, a couple hours, or at most a week. Well, it turns out that sending this many pings was hell on my home network. And not only does it end up dropping a lot of the pings, so it's useless, it renders the whole network completely unusable, which is definitely a no-no for the work-from-home lifestyle. And I was really only able to push this to about 1,000 pings per second, which is nothing. It could be that my ISP is throttling me, or there's NAT tables which aren't big enough to handle this many different addresses, or DDoS protection, or I'm just bad at this. Who knows? In any case, I ended up renting some time on some servers and some clusters so that I could finish the job, because the best excuse is that you just freaking did it. So I finished it up, and now we can look at the whole internet. So here is the internet. Let me zoom in a little bit. Actually, let me zoom in a lot. Here we have every IP address on the internet. You can see them at the bottom left. And the dot will be white if it responded to my ping and black if not. And here I've arranged the IP addresses using a Hilbert curve, which is a sort of fractal space-filling curve that looks like this, which is a standard way to do this. This is not a video about the Hilbert curve. It's not even a video about pinging the internet. There's some somewhat interesting parts here. So this white block here always responded to my pings. That's because it's the loop back address 127 star, which is basically my local computer. So it always responds to that. Up here are a bunch of reserved or multicast addresses, so it makes sense that none of those ever responded. Throughout the rest, we can see a lot of different characters, so I'll just give you a bit of a tour, depending on how this address space has been allocated. And each of these corresponds to a different, network, which is broken into sub-networks. This one has fairly fine-grained divisions. This reminds me of a farmland allocation in the United States. That's that square. Over here, we see a network that is very likely to respond to your ping, although there are some blackout regions. This area has all sorts of patterns in it. I actually really like this. We've got some stuff you could print on a tie. We've got some mazes. We got some Tetris pieces. Maybe even some letters here. We got a crossword puzzle. And by the way, this way of mapping the internet is basically canonical, and it wouldn't be that hard to embed some kind of picture or message in here. Like, how cool would it be to embed a little QR code in this, right? Like, it would be a little bit cool. Maybe a little embarrassing too. Anyway, that's the internet. Probably somewhere in here is your computer too. And now I yearn to build our first virtual hard drive using what we've learned. This turns out to be no big deal. In Unix, storage systems are abstracted as quote-unquote block devices, which are quote-unquote just files. One way to make a block device would be to implement a kernel module, but then I'd be doing a lot of rebooting. NBDKit, which stands for No Big Deal Kit, is a library for creating network block devices in user space, which you could use for serious purposes or for silly purposes like today's. In order to implement a device, you just have to implement a function like read, which takes some address and a length and returns the data that's at that address, and write, which does the opposite. Once you make one of these virtual devices, you can mount it on the system, you can format it with some file system, and then you can store files on it. Now, the smallest block device that I can make any use of is 51,200 bytes. And to do that, I need to use the FAT12 file system, which is from the DOS era, used for like 5 1/4-inch floppy drives. So what we're going to do is make a device that has 100 512 byte blocks. Each of those blocks is going to be stored by a number of outstanding pings. And I'm going to use multiple pings per block for redundancy in case one of those pings doesn't come back. I don't want to lose my data. Now, despite the fact that I already pinged the entire internet, I created the list of those hosts by hand. And part of the reason for this is I wanted to make sure I wasn't like hammering someone's cell phone on a metered connection. But also, I want hosts that are geographically diverse, because I don't want correlated failures. And I want them to be high reliability. I want them to respond to my 512 byte pings pretty much every time. But I also want them to be slow. And that's kind of a strange combination, right? Usually you want it to be fast and reliable, and here I want it to be slow and reliable. So this wasn't so hard. I searched for things like most popular websites in Madagascar, and I manually just checked them until I found ones that had the desired qualities. Now, you can check the technical report for the implementation details if you want. It is a little tricky to do this because since I'm not actually storing any of the data, if someone wants to read from this drive, I have to wait until I receive a ping back before I can process their request. And writes have a similar challenge. The biggest problem here is the aforementioned throttling to about 1,000 pings a second. I barely got this working, but it would have been nice if I could send a few million pings per second instead of 1,000. I also built a UI for this thing, which we'll see in a second. So now what I want to do is stand up the drive, and I want to benchmark it to see how well it performs. In order to do that, I need to figure out what data I want to store on this drive. So I decided a fitting file, one that is a kind of improper hierarchy, would be RFC 792, a text file that describes the Internet Control Message Protocol, ICMP, echo, and echo reply that we're using. That thing is 30 kilobytes, so it just barely fits on the drive. So here it is running that benchmark. The white blocks are healthy blocks. Those are blocks where we have the full target number of pings outstanding. If a block isn't white, that means we've lost a ping and then it's in danger of failing. And that will happen all of the time. The crossed out blocks have not yet been written, so they don't have any data. The red dot indicates a block with an outstanding write, so you'll see that move around as the benchmark goes, and a green block the same for reading. At the bottom, you can see some of the hosts and statistics. I keep track of the statistics on the host so that I don't overload one host, and if it becomes less reliable or too fast, then I try to avoid using it. After the benchmark finishes, I guess there's a hiccup in the system or something, and I actually do lose some data. So a couple of these blocks die and don't come back. That will happen. This is not a reliable way of storing data. But we can look at the file that I stored and read that protocol description. You'll see right here, there's an area that was lost. That's all zeros now. But the benchmark did work completely, so we can get some numbers. But I don't just want to evaluate these drives by their speed. Let's also consider the qualitative aspect. Qualitatively, this is a pretty good hardware drive. It does solve a problem that we don't have, which is to pretend we have a fast network but no memory in which to store data. It treats latency as a desirable quantity, contrary to the usual preference. And it was harder to make than I expected. The cost is not too bad. I have to have a computer, but I always have to have a computer. My home network costs about $80 a month for one quote-unquote gigabit. And this is about as much as I can store before the thing fails. So this ends up being about 0.15 cents per byte per month, which is not too bad. Longevity, however, is poor. The benchmark succeeds with 100% accuracy, like I mentioned, but the data is lost readily if you leave it running for a few minutes. And since we store the data externally using untrusted hosts, they can just send back whatever data they want and corrupt the drive. On the other hand, since we don't store any data locally, we could consider this non-volatile storage, in the sense that if we completely lose power, the data still exists as long as we can reboot in about 100 milliseconds to receive the pings as they arrive, which is kind of unlikely. The speed is pretty slow. I got about 14 kilobytes a second reading and writing, which are basically the same operation. The power consumption for me is low, but the internet itself actually uses a lot of power. A typical undersea cable is excited with power on the order of tens of kilowatts, and they have repeaters every 100 kilometers or so, which is a lot of power. It's a lot of juice. If I was the only one using this, it would be very, very inefficient. Fortunately, many people are using the internet, and these pings are a tiny fraction of the bandwidth. And if I assume that my internet bill covers the marginal cost of the power for the internet, which makes sense, then it turns out to be about 5.8 microwatts per byte. In terms of harm to society, the drive is definitely harmful to my home network. Whether you can consider that a positive or negative to society is left as an exercise to the reader. At this scale, it's a trivial impact on the internet at large, but if we were to do this to store many terabytes of data, or if everyone were doing this, it would be pretty bad for the shared infrastructure. And we're kind of freeloading off the willingness of other hosts to respond to our pings, and so that would be somewhat antisocial. Speaking of antisocial, I'm sorry to remind you about Vladimir Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine, but this section concerns a hard drive made from Soviet blocks. And when I say that, of course I mean Tetris.
Sostki disk.
Tetris is an inventory management survival horror game from the Soviet Union in 1984. It features 19 principal characters, which are these. And like all living things, they're made up of pixels or blocks, so we can make a block device out of these. The Tetris playfield is 10 squares wide and 20 squares high. So the idea is to draw some pattern inside the playfield which will encode data as bits. And we can of course do this on multiple rows to encode several bytes within the playfield. Now one thing to notice is that we can't fill up an entire row, that is all ones, because that clears a line in Tetris. It's also impossible to leave a row entirely empty unless there's nothing above it. So a row of all zeros is also impossible. A less obvious thing to note is parity. Because dropping a piece adds 4 blocks and clearing a line removes 10 blocks, and these are both even, the board will always have an even number of blocks on it. That means we can't store a byte with odd parity on its own. So I only store 8 bits per row and leave the first 2 columns for parity and support. That way we don't need to store any completely empty or completely full rows, which are impossible. Speaking of impossible, it's pretty hard to play and create arbitrary patterns, especially floating blocks. But that's the essence of harder drives. In order to make this easier, we want to get rid of one big obstacle, which is if you're getting pieces at random, it makes it really hard to plan out your strategy. Even when you're playing this game normally, not getting a line for a long time can be a real drag. So the first step is going to be to reverse engineer the random number generator of the game so that we can control what piece we get. Today I'm going to be working with Nintendo Tetris for the Nintendo Entertainment System. This game has a random number generator that's updated every single frame and determines the next piece at the moment that one lands. And that means that if I take more or less time as I drop a piece, I can influence what piece I get. The core of this routine is something called a linear feedback shift register. Equivalent C code for that thing looks like this. You have a 16-bit number, you shift it over, you pull out some of the bits and XOR them together, and then the result of that goes in the high order bit. The setup is really simple. It has a period of 32,767 before we see a repeated state, and that's pretty good. Incidentally, part of the reason we know this is that Solomon Golom, who studied these things and wrote the book on LFSRs, also wrote the book on polyominoes, which are a generalization of tetraominoes, and apparently that book inspired Tetris. So it's fitting that his work appears inside the source code of the Nintendo version. That said, it is possible to do better than this. It's known that you can have a period of 65,535 if you'd use different constants. This is one of several deficiencies I found in Tetris as I was reverse engineering it. And it would be easily fixed. Maybe one day I'll release a version 1.1 hot fix. Now let's look at how that random number generator is used to generate random pieces. Equivalent C code is on the right, but I want to show you this diagrammatically. The first thing we do is take the random state, add to it the number of pieces we've dropped so far, mod 8, and that gives us essentially a random dice roll from 0 to 7. Now this number is pretty random. Actually, in any given state, the maximum I would ever have to wait before seeing the number that I want is 98 frames. But most of the time, I'll get the number that I want after a dozen frames or so. The histogram looks like this in case you're curious. So if that were the whole thing, this would be easy. In order to get a certain piece to come up, I just wait a certain number of frames until the next piece will be the one I want, and I'm done. But here's the rub. There are 2 cases where I roll a second die. First is if I roll a 7. Second is if I would drop the same piece that I just had. The goal is to make that less common. In each of these cases, I update the LFSR again, and then I use it in some other wacky formula to roll a 7-sided die. And this time, I don't care about duplicates. I just take the piece that I roll. Now I can kind of understand why they wrote the code the way they did here, but it actually contains some serious problems. One of them is that in some conditions, it's impossible to get a duplicate piece. For example, on the third piece of the game, if I just saw a line, it's impossible to get another line, no matter how long you wait. Now the reason for this is that although superficially you're rolling 2 different dice, and so it should be fine, you just need to get lucky, consecutive dice rolls are actually really correlated. So if we go back to this guy, who, by the way, knew about this problem, This red region here is the part of the shift register that's used to produce the output value. And we can see that in 2 consecutive states, 2 of the bits are going to be exactly the same. So there's not that many combinations of 2 consecutive dice rolls. This is also a fixable problem, but we got to work with the game we got. So this adds a constraint for us, which is that as we form a plan to drop pieces to make our pattern, we really ought to avoid duplicates completely so that we don't get ourselves stuck. Other than that, because we can predict the value of the random number generator, we can ensure that we get the piece that we want at just the right time. So next up is to figure out how to use those pieces to generate the pattern to encode the information we want on our Tetris hard drive. I solved this problem in a modular way. What I do is initialize the board to a known position, and then for each byte, I'll find a sequence of moves that puts that byte on the board, given the known position, and then puts it back in the known position. The very beginning of the game looks like this. I always play these same sequence of moves, which clears the board and then places that S shape in the leftmost column. Each byte's plan will only be able to assume that S is there, nothing else about the board. You'll see a little hesitation on the pieces sometimes. That's it deliberately waiting so that we get the drop on the right frame, and thus get the right random next piece. We just wrote a couple zeros to show how this next part doesn't depend on any support below it, and the board is now back in that standard position. Next, we're going to write the byte 2E, which in binary is 00101110. Sometimes when we reach a very long drought with the RNG, which can be up to 98 frames, we actually pause the game in order to slow it down even more, which is annoying. Now the bits are in their correct place, but we need to clear the garbage that's above it and put it back in standard position. And then we can just repeat that process over and over again to write bytes into the playfield. Of course, one Tetris game storing 8 bytes is not enough for a hard drive. So we can do this on many Tetris boards simultaneously. Here's a demo of that. I'm highlighting only the parts that encode the data, or here are some letters and drawings. By the way, I found the solutions for each byte by a computer search. It's not that hard to find a solution, but finding a small solution takes a lot of time, at least with my algorithm. I plotted the length of the best solution for each byte in this graphic, where the first row is the byte 0, then 1, and so on. And lighter cells use more moves. There are some symmetries and patterns visible, but I was somewhat disappointed not to see the familiar Triforce pattern appear here, as it has so many times before. It might be that the solutions are not quite optimal, but they're probably close. Alternatively, it could simply be that this is the exception that proves the high rule. But this is also not even close to enough Tetris games to store a file that's of interest. And here the most beautiful choice of file to store is the Tetris ROM file itself, which is 49 kilobytes. So I need 8,640 NES emulators, which is not really that big of a deal, except for trying to fit them all on the screen so that I can visualize this thing. And here's that thing running the benchmark, which is writing tetris.nes onto those 8,640 emulators. That takes several hours to finish, but it does work. It's actually very reliable. Each one of these is a real Tetris game, although it's being rendered with individual pixels. To read the data out, we just inspect the memory of the emulator, which has the Tetris playfield at a particular place in memory, so that's easy and fast. After the benchmark finishes, with the file still written to the drive, I can load up an NES emulator and load the Tetris game and play it off that drive as it's being stored in the 8,600 other emulators. So here I am doing that. And ironically, I have a really long drought with no eye shapes here, so I only have 100 points, but you can see I'm gearing up to score some sweet, high-scoring Tetrises. Let's see how it stacks up. Looking at the qualitative aspect again, this is another good harder drive. It solves a problem we don't have, which is to make a hard drive, aka a block device, with a triple entendre, the Soviet block. Implementing it meant solving several decent computational problems, which I enjoyed, and it's satisfying to watch it go. The cost is not too bad, mainly because computers are really cheap. Each Nintendo emulator takes 1.6 megabytes of RAM, which could definitely be improved, but that's what we got. And so I can store about 5,200 bytes per gigabyte of the computer's RAM. At today's costs, that's about 0.084 cents per byte. The longevity here is normal. The data doesn't rot or corrupt over time. But if you turn the computer off, everything is lost. On the positive side, because everything is stored locally, bandits do not have any access to the data to read it or tamper with it. The speed is pretty bad. We write the 50-byte Tetris ROM in 3 hours and 18 minutes, which is 2.57 bytes per second. Reading is pretty fast though, because that just comes right out of the Nintendo's memory. Power usage is similarly reasonable. A gigabyte of RAM is about 375 milliwatts, so this works out to 72 microwatts per byte. We could compare this to the same thing running on a real Nintendo Entertainment System, which could store 1 byte in about 1.25 watts. The harm to society depends on whether we do this on a computer in emulation, in which case there's no harm, or by scooping up thousands of classic consoles and cartridges on the secondary market. In this case, it would be harmful. Many people still like to use these consoles for their intended purpose, and hoarding is unethical. Now, speaking of using things for their intended purpose, I'm sorry to remind you of the global pandemic still killing thousands of people every day. But this next section concerns a hard drive made of used COVID-19 tests.
SARS-CoV-2. SARS-CoV-2.
Q is a bougie COVID-19 test from 2021. The test consists of a reusable reader, which costs $200, and a single-use cartridge, which is $65 each. You insert a nasal swab, it runs its little lab on a chip. It's actually quite cool, notwithstanding the eye-popping cost. My workplace lets us test regularly for free. So I started collecting the used cartridges over the course of several months and soliciting them from my friends as well. Now, 2 different colors of gray could in principle encode data, but these sticks get in the way and it's just not satisfying. We could admire the cartridges on the dry salt bed for eternity, but they're actually quite ingenious and deserve to be disassembled. I recommend only doing this to negative tests. When you stick the nose swab in, it of course delivers the snotty sample, but the insertion also mechanically moves these thorns and rips open these foil ampules which contain reagents. The assay is described as nucleotide amplification, which suggests something like PCR. But it doesn't significantly change temperature during a test, so it's probably not literally PCR. I think it's probably LAMP. After it's amplified, I think it flows through this channel here so that they can detect the result. And finally into this sponge for safekeeping. If you pull off all the chemistry pieces though, you'll find that there's a tiny 8-pin microchip on board. And if you have really good eyesight, you can read that it says ST24C04WP, which is a serial EEPROM. This is a programmable read-only memory, so it's read-only but also writable. It's probably used by the system to store calibration data and maybe expiration date or something. After soldering tiny wires onto these tiny pins and writing a driver, I had hoped to see some secret message congratulating me on my steady hands, beginning an alternative reality game whose prize was the inheritance of an eccentric billionaire. I probably wouldn't have time for that anyway. There doesn't seem to be anything actually interesting in the ROM, but that doesn't mean we can't put something of our own that's interesting on the ROM. Now, unfortunately, this thing only stores 512 bytes. So in order to make a hard drive that can store something interesting, we're going to need a lot of them. And then we're going to need to hook them up somehow. I made a circuit board to hook these cartridges together. The EEPROMs are I2C devices, so they could in principle be on the same bus. But unfortunately, they're all the same, and so they have the same address. This means that I actually need to use bus switches, that's this component, to connect and disconnect them from the bus. Those switches are indexed by a demultiplexer, which takes 3 address bits and selects one of the 8 Q cartridges on a board. Each cartridge has this custom mount, which is a little bit tricky to design. The card edge is supposed to slide into some spring-mounted connector, but I wanted to solder them directly. So I made some fine castellated edges. Unwisely, I decided to add decorative LEDs, which would show which Q cartridge was activated at any given time. This accounts for most of the complexity of the circuit board. Finally, I made a whole bunch of these boards which are all identical, but one of them has an additional section populated. This connects to the Raspberry Pi and so on. This is a nice design because I have to order these things in quantity. So all of them have this vestigial part that's only used one time. Assembling the boards is labor intensive, but not that hard. The only tricky thing is these custom connectors. So I 3D printed a jig to hold the Q cartridge at a 98-degree angle while I was soldering, which helped a lot. Then I made some custom enclosures and wired them all together. And hours and hours and hours later, On the eve of the SIGBOVIK deadline, this happened. Well, this is a reenactment.
Don't you die on me.
But it did die. I completely fried the Raspberry Pi. Fortunately, I had a backup. And then I did it again. This caused me to realize it was not simply some kind of fluke. Who would have guessed that this janky ceiling outlet would have been wired incorrectly? Anyway, I used up my last 2 Raspberry Pis, and it's impossible to get more right now.
Supply chain.
So unfortunately, we're unable to benchmark this device, but we can still evaluate it. I would say that this is a decent harder drive. It definitely solves a problem we don't have, which is that I want to keep around all these used COVID-19 tests. It was also a large effort, although most of it was just about soldering really small stuff, or repeating the same action over and over and over again for hours. On the other hand, EEPROMs fundamentally store data, and so it's not that weird to use them as a hard drive. It could, however, be described as very silly, given that a single 1 megabyte NAND flash chip costs about 30 cents. On the other hand, mucho demerits because it doesn't work, at least as a hard drive. But on the other hand, it does work as a smoke machine. The cost is significant. Here's the bill of materials per board. The main thing is the 8 COVID tests, which cost $65 each, but there are a number of other components, including the custom PCB, totaling about $531 per board. This doesn't even count the hour or more to assemble each board. For a system large enough to store the SARS-CoV-2 genome, it costs $6,936. All told, it costs a little under 13 cents per byte. This is the only drive we considered where data is retained when it's powered off. So that's great. The datasheet for the EEPROM rates it at 200 years of data retention, which at this point is probably going to outlast human civilization. Due to explosion, the speed of this drive is currently unknown. The power consumption is excellent. The Raspberry Pi, when it's working, uses less than 3 watts. And the incremental cost of adding a byte comes mostly from the EEPROM, which comes out to about 19 nanowatts per byte. We find that this drive is actually beneficial to society. For one thing, it's made from trash. Testing helps prevent the spread of disease and saves lives. And finally, because the tests contain captured body fluids, this brings a much-needed human element to computing. Speaking of captured body fluids, get out your barf bag because it's time for another round of Things Tom Hates. The name of this stock app, Think or Swim. It's of course a play on the idiom to sink or swim, meaning metaphorically to toss someone into deep water to survive by their own efforts or else drown. Makes sense for an app that lets consumers trade derivatives, but the obvious problem here is that if it's think or swim, then are we now asking the subject to survive by their own efforts, i.e. swim, or else think? Huh? Or is it they must think carefully about their trades or else they will survive? What? 2. Poison ivy. There's just no point to this plan. 3. Cryptocurrencies. I have no objection to cryptography in finance. I actually love cryptography. I read this whole damn book in college. But the current scene is just vomitous. Cryptocurrency significantly harms the planet while taking advantage of people's technical and financial illiteracy. Now, it's hard to avoid noticing the common prefix of blockchain and block device. So a head-to-head comparison might be instructive. Let's look at Bitcoin, the most popular cryptocurrency. It's append-only by design, but it does store data, namely the transactions. For comparison's sake, we'll consider usage where the head of the blockchain contains the full data, a write is accomplished by mining a new block, and a read is accomplished by reading the head of the chain. For Bitcoin, the block size is just 1 megabyte, and the network automatically adjusts to mine 1 block every 10 minutes. I did not actually implement this, both because of the gag reflex and because I don't have that kind of money. Despite hating it, I must admit that Bitcoin makes a pretty good harder drive. It solves a problem we don't have, which is to imagine a world where we can't find a few trustworthy parties, the majority of whom are acting in good faith. The solution is elegant in the small, putting aside its obvious fatal flaws, and comically absurd when taken to its logical conclusion. It's impressively wasteful, and it gets more wasteful automatically. In short, it would make a solid SIGBOVIK paper. The only problem is that people are using it in seriousness and all of the social problems that entails. Power is, of course, catastrophically high. It uses 15.74 kilowatts to store 1 byte. Just the act of mining uses almost 1/3% of the entire world's energy consumption. And all this accomplishes is proving that you wasted energy so that you don't need to trust a bank or a set of banks? The longevity is very good. Nominally, the data can't even be erased. Of course, the data are stored by adversarial bandits themselves, and if a colluding majority decide to do so, they can just change the data to anything they want. The cost is pretty high, especially for the power. Mining a single block yields about $342,000 in March 2022, so if we assume that's profitable, that's a maximum of 34.2 cents per byte. The drive is pretty slow at 1 megabyte every 10 minutes, but it is at least faster than the hard drive made out of Tetris emulators. So score 1 point there. This is approximately as fast as one 14.4 kilobit modem. The harm to society is significant. Aside from the catastrophic waste of resources, the primary use case is speculation on the currency itself or on dubious certificates of authenticity for JPEGs. As a slow, expensive, non-atomic, yet irrevocable payment mechanism, cryptocurrency is best suited for extortive transactions like ransomware. Okay, all right. Thank you for indulging my tirade. We're mostly here to have fun today. But remember that technology has a large impact on society, and we as technologists have a large influence over that. Speaking of fun, you might ask, Tom, that looks like a lot of hard work. Why go through all that trouble? And to that I say, we do these things not because they are hard, but because they are harder drives.
Harder drive. Harder drive.